Obliterate the day that I was born. Blank out the night I was conceived. Let it be a black hole in space. May God above forget it ever happened, erase it from the books. May the day of my birth be buried in deep darkness, shrouded by the fog, swallowed by the night. And the night of my conception, let the devil take it. Rip the date off the calendar, delete it from the almanac. Turn that night into pure nothingness. No sounds of pleasure from that night ever. May those who are good at cursing curse that day. Unleash the sea beast, Leviathan, upon it. May its morning stars turn to black cinders, waiting for a daylight that never comes, never once seeing the first light of dawn. And why? Because that day released me from my mother's womb into a life of so much trouble. Why didn't I just die at birth, so my first breath would be my last? These are the words spoken by Job after losing everything, breaking 7 days and 7 nights of silence. They are the words of a man who was grieving so hard that he came to curse the day that he was born. Job lost his oxen, his donkeys and sheep, his servants, his sons and his daughters, his wealth, his health, his family, and even his wife to a degree as he lost her respect. And for a time, Job lost his will to live. It can happen to any of us or any of the people that we love because life is hard and the mind is a fragile thing. Hemingway once wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong in the broken places." And a lot of preacher types like myself love to end the quote there on that hopeful note. But Hemingway continues right after that. "Those that the world will not break, it kills. It kills the very good, the very gentle, and the very brave impartially. And if you are none of those, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry." This year, our church has experienced incredible loss. Beloved longtime church members like Francesca Quick, Susan Zangi, Stuart Dixon, Bill Snipes, Mary Lou Buck, Barbara Herring, Caroline Tate, and many more have died this year. And our summer has been bookended by the sudden and tragic deaths of 2 of our ministers' spouses, Neil Tuning and Tori James. It has been too much this year. Our hearts are breaking, and we are my God, why have you forsaken us? And how long, O Lord, will this continue?" As a staff and a church, we are grieving, we are hurting, and we're trying to come to grips with these losses that have changed our lives. Where do we turn? No other story in the Bible or history has given voice to grief and loss, pain and despair, that which is most difficult in human life, more powerfully than the book of Job. It may be why Job has been described as the defining myth of Western civilization. This epic tale has cultivated imaginations for thousands of years, inviting countless people throughout history to wrestle with its themes of suffering and faith and doubt, loss and God's justice, the problem of evil, and the most confounding realities of human existence. Most of the prominent figures in Western thought have felt compelled, drawn to the story of Job. Early Christians, like Augustine, saw the story as a metaphor for death and resurrection. Gregory the Great believed that Job was about perseverance in the face of suffering. The Jewish philosopher Maimonides believed that Job was a critique of traditional religion. Aquinas used Job to extol God's providence over all of creation. Calvin, on the other hand, contended that Job demonstrated that God's providence was unknowable. That famous line in Handel's Messiah, "I know that my Redeemer lives," led the book of Job to be used in burial liturgies and music and folklore for generations. And the story of Job's life has inspired great works of literature and art, from Milton to Dostoevsky, Kafka, and Kant, William Blake, H.G. Wells, Robert Frost, Elie Wiesel, and even the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Both Karl Barth and Carl Jung thought that Job was a precursor to the Gospels, foreshadowing our need for a Messiah. And Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologian, argued that Job is about the unjust suffering of the poor. And following in the footsteps of many before him, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who I know many of you know, believed that Job was a theodicy that confronted the problem of evil with the age-old question: why do bad things happen to good people? While the story of Job has become many things to many people throughout history, it is first and foremost a book of wisdom that falls squarely within an ancient Near Eastern tradition of wisdom literature that dates back to the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures of the 3rd millennium BC. It is a very old book. And there are two genres of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East. There is the first that consists of statements by sages and the wise that offer teachings about prudence and morality and divinity that we find in the book of Proverbs. The other genre is existential works that deal with the relationship between man and God, reward and punishment, the problems of suffering and evil. The protagonist is often a just sufferer or a good person who is beset by tragedy, who tries to understand their lot in life in relationship to the divine. Job is obviously the most famous of that second genre, but it was preceded by other stories just like it. The Babylonian theodicy, the Akkadian poem of the righteous sufferer, the Sumerian dialogue between a man and his God. And now today, after generations of interpretations all over the map, it is difficult for us to go back to thinking about the story of Job as a form of wisdom literature. We wonder, what does death, what does loss, what does grief, what does mourning, what does pain and suffering have to do with wisdom? Then we see smack in the middle of the book of Job, there is an entire chapter dedicated to wisdom, an ode to wisdom, a poem to wisdom, which uses beautiful, flowery language to proclaim that wisdom cannot be searched for or mined like gold or gems or precious metals. It cannot be found in the depths of the earth or the depths of the sea. In addition, wisdom is not a commodity that can be bought or sold or stored up like wealth and riches. Even more disconcerting, in that chapter 28, the author contends that only God knows the way to wisdom and where it can be found. Wisdom, it says, is inaccessible to human beings, hidden from our eyes, impossible to find in the land of the living. So Job here is a story of wisdom and a critique of wisdom at the same time, because traditional wisdom, it turns out, cannot hold up in the face of suffering and death. Grief makes traditional wisdom into nonsense. The writer of Job sings out, "But where shall wisdom be found? Where does wisdom come from? Where is the place of understanding? Mortals don't know the way to it. It's not found in the land of the living. It's hidden from the eyes of all people. It's concealed from the birds of the air. Death and destruction say, we have only heard a rumor of wisdom with our ears. Truly, the reverence of God, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil, that is understanding." And then there's that curious line in this beautiful poem. Why would death and destruction be able to hear rumors of wisdom that only God knows how to find? Perhaps it's because of their causal relationship to grief and suffering. The father of Greek tragedy, Aeschylus, was instructive on this. "The one who learns must suffer," he wrote. "And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop on the heart. and in our own despair, against our will, wisdom comes to us by the awful grace of God. Wisdom comes to us by the awful grace of God. It is not, make no mistake, it is not that grief leads to wisdom, but that grief itself, we see, is its own kind of wisdom that transcends the wisdom of the world and brings us as close as we can get to the inaccessible wisdom of God. The Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo was considered by some the greatest poet of the 20th century in any language. Thomas Merton called him the greatest universal poet since Dante. And he crafted an extraordinary poem about a God who weeps for creation and who grieves with all of us. Vallejo wrote, "I feel God journey with me. When the sun sets on the sea, together we walk as it grows dark. We are all together, but we walk like orphans. I feel God, and he gives color to my life. He is kind and sad, like those who attend to the sick and the dying. He whispers like a lover in distress. His heart must hurt for his creation. Oh my God, though I have just come to you, I love so much as it grows dark, and in the balance within my heart, I weigh and weep for frail creation. And you, what do you weep for? You who love with your immense and whirling heart. I consecrate you, God, because I love you so much, because you never smile, because your heart must ache as time continues." If God is love, that necessarily means that God grieves, because grief is a word for that which we have lost. If God is love, then that means that God's grief is greater and deeper than anything we could ever imagine. If God is love, then our grief does not separate us from God, but draws us more closely, because no matter how deep our grief, God's love is deeper still. It is because of God's grief that the psalmist can say, God is nearest to the brokenhearted. There is no answer to the problem of suffering, except this: God is always with us in our grief, even when we can't feel God. But what about the friends? After tearing their robes and covering themselves in ashes and weeping aloud, Job's friends sat with him in silence for 7 days. And in doing so, in those 7 days, they were the presence of God with Job amid his suffering and amid his grief. If only they'd kept their mouths shut. If only they'd heeded the advice of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who ended his magnum opus with the words, "Where one cannot speak, there one should be silent." But those of you who know the story will remember that for the next 20 chapters of the book, Job's friends proceed to theologize and philosophize about Job's suffering, which is exactly the opposite of what people need you to do when they are grieving. His friends imagined that they were wise enough to explain Job's suffering, but instead they only added to his pain. Job's friends did not throw around the trite and horrifyingly insensitive cliches that we hear today. Everything happens for a reason. God needed an angel. When God closes a door, he opens a window. God never gives us more than we can handle. Forms of theological malpractice these are, designed to make us feel better that do nothing for the one who is grieving. Job's friends were different. They were serious scholars who developed well-formed arguments rooted in the most advanced theology and philosophy of the time, trying to explain why Job had lost everything. In their day, the highest form of wisdom was that our relationship with the divine was determined by a system of reward and punishment. Therefore, all the arguments of Job's friends came down to one point: Job or his ancestors must have sinned or done something to deserve this. Otherwise, it would never have happened. Today, we call this theology the prosperity gospel of health and wealth that proclaims if you do the right things, believe the right things, then God will grant you material blessings. It's the same old religious system that existed in the ancient Near East of rewards and punishments. A world thousands of years ago, a theology thousands of years old that is still as toxic today as it was back then. This is a nonsense theology. It has no word for those who are suffering or grieving. It simply justifies the status quo, the way of the world, and sanctifies the people who already have power. There is an egotistical hubris in the certainty of Job's friends who seem to overestimate their wisdom in relationship to his. Their arguments fall flat in the face of Job's grief and suffering, and they're not the ones that God comes to and speaks to out of the whirlwind through their prideful theologizing. Job's friends speak about God, but in grief, Job speaks to God like a prayer. This is the wisdom of grief, which no theology or philosophy can contend with or explain away. Grief is the primal, raw, and unrefined truth of human existence, which is a deep and profound wisdom that all the libraries and encyclopedias and philosophies and religions and self-help books in the world can only scratch the surface. Grief knows what nothing else can know, because grief knows what God knows. Grief knows that death and loss are inevitable parts of human existence, and that life is a fragile and fleeting thing, a precious gift. Grief knows that we are not in control of our lives, other people, or the universe. So we must humbly acknowledge our limits and our dependence on others. Grief knows that life cannot be forced or hurried, that our body's rhythms are the only path. Grief knows what is most important in life cannot be bought or sold, that our relationships are everything that we have, and that compassion is paramount. Grief knows that we're not promised another hour, so we should be present in every moment and try our best to seize the day. Grief knows that there is not one way to live or one way to believe, and that all of us are flawed and imperfect, and that forgiveness is our only salvation. Grief knows that we should be true to ourselves because everyone else is already taken. Grief knows that our past must be reckoned with in the present, or our future will simply be more of the same. Grief knows that when everything else is stripped away, love is all that remains, because love is the only force that has the power to transcend death. There's a film from 2017. It's called The Merowitz Stories. It follows a group of estranged and dysfunctional adults trying to live in the shadow of their grumpy and disinterested father, who happens to be a famous professor and renowned sculptor. They gather in New York City for an event celebrating their father's artistic legacy, and the event does not go well. And eventually, during their trip, their father is hospitalized with a chronic subdural hematoma. Even after a life in which their father has caused so much pain and suffering, hurt feelings and estrangement and distance and bitter resentment, at the very end of his life, a grieving son stands over his hospital bed and whispers into a dying father's ear the Ho'oponopono prayer. It's a simple Hawaiian practice of reconciliation and forgiveness. He repeats it over and over again to his father in these words: "I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you, I love you. I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you, I love you. I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you, I love you." Grief gave this son the wisest words that could be spoken, which are often both the simplest and the hardest words to say. Job was vindicated in this story as the wisest human being because of the way that he grieved. But there was one thing that Job got wrong. It would not have been better if he had never been born. Despite all his sufferings, Job's life was a gift to the world. The same is true today of each of us. The world would be a lesser place if any of us had never lived or were not here. Every single human life that has ever existed on this earth is a sacred, unique, singular, irreplaceable, unrepeatable creation of infinite value, worth, and dignity, fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of the living God. Every one of us is a beloved child of God in whom God is well pleased. Every hair on our head, or no hair at all, is numbered. And the world would not be the same without us. No matter who we are, or what we've lost, or how much we've suffered, or where we've faltered, or when we've failed, every person has a story and a song that should be honored because it has unparalleled gifts for us and for the rest of the world. We are here as human beings to witness to each other's lives, to celebrate the beautiful diversity and goodness of all of creation and our fellow human beings. Grief is what unites us with God and the sufferings of the world, which is why the philosopher Rumi said that grief can be the garden of compassion. If we keep our hearts open through everything, pain can become our greatest ally in life's search for love and wisdom. All the theology and philosophy and wisdom of the world can't stand in the face of pure, unadulterated grief. It is a wisdom that transcends all the other modes of knowledge in the world because it is the school of love for the people and the things that we've lost. Words fall deaf to it, whirlwinds bow down to it, and the world must always respect it. Grief is the wisdom that we practice with God and each other as we walk through a life of suffering and death, chaos and destruction. We don't try to pretend we're not grieving. We don't try to philosophize our pain like Job's friends. We don't try to explain it all away. We simply try to hold on to each other, to weep with each other, to sing with each other, to dance with each other through the painful mystery of life, all while repeating the same 10 words over and over again. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Amen.